Good morning. I miss you guys. Today we're going to start reading chapter 5, The Red Circle. So this is after Louis comes back from the Olympics, after he places 8th, and now he's trying to train for the Olympics that are coming up in Japan in 1940. So this chapter is titled The Red Circle. I don't know if you've noticed, but every chapter title has had some kind of meaning behind it. That kind of gives us a clue of what the chapter is about. So this chapter's title is The Red Circle. The Red Circle is actually for Japan. So we're going to see why that's so important in this chapter. Okay. Chapter 5, The Red Circle. At USC, Louis spent mornings in class and afternoons training. In the evenings, he and his teammates wedged into his 1931 Ford and drove to Torrance for Louise Zamperini's spaghetti. In his spare time, Louis crashed society weddings, worked as a movie extra, and harassed his housemates with practical jokes, replacing their deviled ham with cat food and their milk with laxatives. Ugh. He pursued girls by all means necessary, once landing a date by hurling himself into a girl's car and then pretending to have been struck. On the track, he was unstoppable. Focused on the 1940 Tokyo Olympics, he smashed through record after record. By the spring of 1938, he'd whittled his mile time down to 4 minutes, 13.7 seconds, some 7 seconds off of the world record, which now stood at 4 minutes, 6.4 seconds. "There's the next national champion," said Glenn Cunningham to reporters one afternoon. "When he concentrates on this distance, he'll be unbeatable." The reporters turned to see who Cunningham was looking at, and it was Louis, blushing from the roots of his hair. Remember, Cunningham is his role model, and so Cunningham is telling that he's going to be unbeatable. In the 1930s, runners were beginning to toss around the idea of a 4-minute mile. Most observers, including Cunningham, had long believed that it couldn't be done. In 1935, after studying the data on human structural limits, Cunningham's legendary coach proclaimed that it was impossible. The fastest that a human could run a mile, he wrote, was 4 minutes and 1.6 seconds. Pete disagreed. He was certain that Louis had a 4-minute mile in him. Louis had always laughed this off, but in May of 1938, he reconsidered. His coach forbade him, so told him not, to run hills in the mistaken belief that it would damage his heart. But Louis didn't buy into these warnings. Every night, he climbed the Los Angeles Coliseum fence and ran the stairs until his legs went numb. Have you ever run stairs before? If you have, you know that that's intense, that he ran the stairs until his legs went numb every night. By June, his body was humming, capable of speed and stamina beyond anything that he had ever known. He began to think that Pete was right, and he wasn't alone. Running experts published articles suggesting that Louis could be the first 4-minute man. Even Cunningham agreed. In June, Louis arrived at the National Collegiate Athletic Association, NCAA, championships in Minneapolis. Gushing with confidence, he babbled to everyone about his training, his strategy, and how he was gunning for 4 minutes. Why do you think that could be a bad idea? He's spreading the word all about his training. He's gushing about his training, gushing how he thinks he can beat 4 minutes. How do you think that other runners are going to react to that? Probably not good. Word spread that Louis was primed for an epic performance. On the night before the race, a coach visited Louis, and the coach's face was very grim. He said that the other coaches were ordering their runners to injure Louis. Louis dismissed this, certain that no one would ever do such a thing. So here's a picture of Louis getting ready to run. But he was wrong. Halfway through the NCAA championship race, just as Louis was about to take the lead, several runners shouldered in around him and boxed him in. So as they're running on the track, they've got him in a box so he can't move to get around them to get to the front. The man beside him swerved and stomped on his foot, impaling Louis's toe with his spike. Oh, so I don't know if you know, but track spikes are like really thick, especially the old-timey track spikes, and they're on the bottom of your shoe. So he steps on Louis's shoe, and the spike goes through Louis's toe. Oh. So they're beating him up while they're running this race. Then the man in front kicked back, cutting Louis's shin. A third man elbowed Louis's chest so hard that he cracked Louis's rib. The crowd gasped. Bleeding and in pain, Louis was trapped. For a lap and a half, he ran in the cluster of men, restraining his stride to avoid running into the man ahead. And at last, nearing the final lap, he saw a tiny gap. He burst through and sprinted to the lead, and with his shin streaming blood and his chest aching, he won easily. He slowed to a halt, bitter and frustrated. When his coach asked him how fast he thought he'd gone, he said that he couldn't have gone faster than 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Or couldn't have gone, he thought that his time was 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The race time was posted. From the stands, there came a loud applause. Louis had run the mile in 4 minutes and 8.3 seconds. It was the 5th fastest outdoor mile ever run, missing the world record by just 1.9 seconds. His time would stand as an NCAA record for 15 years. So think about this. Think about how good of a runner Louis is. He's boxed in, so they make him run slower in the race. They impale his toe with a track spike. They cut his shin, and they keep him boxed into the last second. So for a lap and a half, he's stuck. Think about if they had not done that, how fast Louis would have finished. He probably would have broken the world record. Weeks later, Japan withdrew as an Olympic host, and the 1940 Games were transferred to Finland. Louis rolled on, winning every race in the 1939 school season. In early 1940, in the indoor mile against America's best runners, he was magnificent, twice beating Cunningham and getting progressively faster. In February, he ran a 4 minute and 8.2 second mile, 0.6 of a second short of the fastest indoor mile ever run. 2 weeks later, he scorched a 4 minutes and 7.9 seconds with the Olympics months away, and Louis was peaking at his ideal moment. So he's getting to his best right before the Olympics. Far away, history was turning. In Europe, Hitler was preparing to conquer the continent. So think about this. This is 1940. This is right around World War II. So while this is happening with Pete, it's taking us over to Europe, where Hitler's trying to take over. I want y'all to remember this because this is in your questions. So think about, why does the narrative shift? It's been all about Louis. Why is the narrative now shifting to talking about Hitler and Europe? In Europe, Hitler was preparing to conquer the continent. In Asia, Japan's leaders had designs of equal magnitude. Poor in natural resources, with its economy floundering, Japan was struggling to support a growing population. Eyeing their nation's resource-rich neighbors, Japan's leaders saw the prospect of economic independence and more. Central to the Japanese identity was the belief that the Japanese were mankind's superior race with the divine right to rule the inferior Asians. Moved by economic need and a sense of density, Japan's leaders planned to conquer the Far East. So Japan is not only Hitler, but Japan is looking at the countries around it and saying, ooh, if we had those resources that that country has, we would be doing fine. And they believe that they're superior to any other race. Who does that kind of sound like? Okay, for decades, Japan's military-dominated government had been preparing for its quest, crafting a muscular army and navy, and through a military-run school system that violently drilled children on Japan's imperial destiny, shaped its people for war. Most ominously, its army encouraged and celebrated extreme brutality in their soldiers. In the late 1930s, Germany and Japan were ready. In 1937, Japan sent its armies smashing into China. 2 years later, Hitler invaded Poland, and the war in Europe began. America was pulled into both conflicts. In Europe, its allies lay in Hitler's path. In the Pacific, its ally China was being ravaged by the Japanese, and its territories of Hawaii, Wake, Guam, and Midway, as well as its Commonwealth of the Philippines, were being threatened. The world was falling into catastrophe. On a dark day, April 1940, the crisis reached into Louis's life. Hitler and his Soviet allies had unleashed their armies on Europe, and the continent was exploding in total war. Finland was struggling. Her Olympic stadium partially collapsed from Russian bombs. The Olympics had been canceled. So how do you think this is going to impact Louis? The Olympics, the thing that he's been pushing for this entire time, for 4 years now, his dream, and it's 1940, so it's almost time for the Olympics. Think about how devastating that has to be for him. They've been canceled. Louis spent the summer of 1940 working as an aircraft factory welder and mourning his lost Olympics. America slid towards war. In Europe, Germany was routing American allies. In the Pacific, Japan was tearing through China and moving into mainland Southeast Asia. To stop Japan, President Franklin Roosevelt declared an embargo, or a trade ban, on war-making materials. Soon, he'd declare an oil embargo and freeze Japanese assets in America, and finally ban all trade with Japan. Still, Japan stormed upward. So if you think about this in history, Japan invades China. China is a U.S. ally, so they're friends with the U.S. So China asks for help. We don't go to war. The U.S. doesn't go to war yet, but what they do is they make sure that none of our goods get transported over to China or to Japan. So the president bans all trade with Japan. And so because the United States bans all trade with Japan, that's what eventually leads them to bombing Pearl Harbor, which we're about to get to. Watching fighter planes soaring over his hangar, Louis felt a pull. He was still feeling it when Congress passed a bill requiring all young men to register for the military draft. Those who enlisted before being drafted could choose their service branch. Louis joined the Army Air Corps. In November of 1941, he arrived at flight school in Houston, Texas. The Air Corps was making him a bomber, or a bombardier. Remember that word, bombardier. Say it 5 times fast. Early on a Sunday morning a few weeks later, a pilot guided a small plane over the Pacific. Below, a dark sea gave way to a strand of white, waves slapping Hawaii's Oahu Island. Below, Pearl Harbor, headquarters of the United States Pacific Fleet, was beginning to stir. At Hickam Field, soldiers were washing a car. At the officers' club, men were wrapping up a poker game. In the barracks, 2 men were having a pillow fight. Outside, a sergeant was peering through a camera lens at his son. Many sailors were sleeping in the warships that were swaying in the harbor. On the deck of the USS Arizona, men were assembling to raise flags, a Sunday morning tradition. Far above them, the pilot set a flare skidding green across the sky. Behind him, 180 warplanes, emblazoned with Japan's red circle emblem, dove for Pearl Harbor. So early in the morning on a Sunday in 1941 in December, all these normal things are going on, and then they see this light that shot through the sky, and behind the light, it come 180 Japanese warplanes, all with a red circle. That's Japan's flag. It's white, and then it has a red circle in the middle. So they see the red circle on the side. On the Arizona, the men looked up. In the barracks, one of the men in the pillow fight suddenly collapsed. He was dead, a 3-inch hole blown through his neck. His friend ran to a window and saw a building heave upward and crumble down. A dive bomber had crashed straight into it. There were red circles on its wings. In Texas, Louis was at the movies watching a matinee. The screen went blank and light flooded into the theater. A man hurried forward. Is there a fire? Louis thought. Servicemen must return to their bases, the man said. Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor. Louis sat there, his eyes wide, his mind fumbling. America was at war. He grabbed his hat and ran from the building. Okay, so that's the end of part 1. So next week, we're going to be reading part 2, which talks about Louis' service in the war. So part 1 was all about his childhood. So if you have to think of a central idea sentence for this chapter, let's think about it. There's 5 questions that you answer. Who, what, when, where, and why. So the who, obviously, was Louis. What was the biggest thing that happened in this section to Louis? He trains for the Olympics and gets better, but his dreams are crushed. When? So who, what, when? When the Olympics are canceled because of World War II. Where did this happen? In the United States when America was at war. Why? So what's the author's purpose? It's informing us. So you would have to make a sentence up with those different who, what, when, where, and why. Also, do not forget to put in your social issues. I saw a couple of people do that yesterday. So if you think about the social issues for this section, one big one, so things that keep a society from being perfect. You've got bullying because they bully Louis on the track at the NCAA championships. And also you have war because World War II has started. All right, I'll talk to y'all later.